Our speaker tonight is Rebecca Rupp, who has a PhD in cell biology and biochemistry from George Washington University and now works as a professional writer. She's the author of some 300 articles in national magazines of topics ranging from the natural history of squirrels to the archaeology of primates, and nearly 20 books for children and adults. She has blogged on food science and the history for National Geographic as a contributing editor to Early American Life and Reprints magazines, and is a science book reviewer for Publishers Weekly. And she's going to talk to us about food. Rebecca, welcome.
Thank you. This talk is called Soup to Nuts. And the reason for that is that it's an idiom that comes from the formal Victorian dinner, which means from beginning to end, as in you start with soup and you end up in the drawing room with nuts and port. And so we're going to talk about the changes in eating over time, sort of the history of eating as it relates to a multi-course Victorian meal. And actually, I've got a book going on this topic that I'm calling 12 Courses, that deals with the history of food through all these various courses of the meal. Our food fads over time have had huge impacts on culture, society, and the environment. And our attitudes toward food, the way we behave with food, has an evolutionary background. Hence, chimps. Basically, how we eat, everything from who gets the last pork chop to who picks up the dinner tab, you can trace it back to chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are our closest primate relatives, and they share food, but they're picky about it. Chimps will only share food with best friends and family members. These are vampire bats. They're much more generous animals. Vampire bats exist Dracula-like on a diet of blood, and they share food with all of a given colony's young bats. Vampire bats can only survive for a couple of days without feeding, which is a really dangerous situation for young and inexperienced bats who sometimes come home empty. So older, wiser bats will save these little pathetic bats by regurgitating part of their meal and feeding the bats. The thing is, if you are the reciprocal of somebody else's partial dinner, you're expected in your turn to also share a meal somewhere down the pike. And bats who fail to share are stigmatized. And if they really fail to share, they're booted out of the colony. Other bats know who they are. So in the same way today, any dinner party means obligations. So historically, being invited to a feast meant incurring a debt. You were expected to plow somebody's field or march with him to war, or, at the very least, invite him to dinner in return. We're getting closer to us. So anthropologists guess that a lot of the complexities of human ethics likely began around a prehistoric campfire with the tit-for-tat obligations of reciprocity. So the reason you bring a bottle of wine as a hostess gift today is evolution. Basically nobody wants to be a cheating bat. So the guess is that, everything from kinship ties to our concepts of fairness and justice may have come out of how food was divvied up around a prehistoric fire. On the other hand, food sharing has never, ever been fair. So quality and quantity of what you get has always reflected a diner's place in the social pecking order. So basically, if you're on top of the social pack, you get more of it and better than if you're at the bottom. When lions feast, the dominant males get in there first and get the largest, that's literally the lion's share of the kill. Well, the females and cubs may just have to gnaw on the chewed bones. So historically, the upper classes got platters of venison in pepper sauce, and the peasants got peas porridge. There was a belief, I kind of love this story, that this situation was actually biologically ordained. You were meant to eat certain foods. And there's a story from the 10th century about Bertoldo. Bertoldo was a fast-talking commoner who managed to inveigle himself into the royal court by getting everybody to think that he himself was a noble. And there he feasted on what they call refined and exquisite dishes, until mysteriously he fell gravely ill. They called in the court physician who couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. They failed to realize that Bertoldo, being a peasant in real life, actually just needed a diet of turnips and onions to recover. He didn't, and so unfortunately he died, a dire lesson to social climbers everywhere. So by the Middle Ages, where you sat at the table was an indication of how important you were. So here we've got the Lord and Lady sitting at a dais right up in the front, the top seats in the room, where everybody else sits. This is actually very much like the Hogwarts dining hall, if you've seen the Harry Potter movies. Everybody else sits at a long table at right angles to the lord of the manor, and in order. You sat strictly in order of your social position. So the more important you were, the further you were from the kitchen. If you were practically sitting in the kitchen, you were the lowest of the low. The round table, the whole idea of the round table, as in King Arthur, was to get rid of this dining sequence so you could see who was the most important by who sat where. At a round table, everybody is equally important. And supposedly, this would eliminate squabbling over social class. Depending on what you read about King Arthur's round table, it sat anywhere from 13 to 1,600 knights, which would have been one hell of a round table. Oh, chair. So status seating inevitably trickled down to commoners. Everybody had an idea of who sat where made a difference as to how important you were. And sometimes status seating meant who got the chair. Now, this chair belonged to John Winthrop Jr., who was the governor of the colony of Connecticut in the 1600s. And you can see whoever planted themselves in that chair was important. Often in the early American colonies, the chair was a really big deal because often families only had one chair. Frequently, lower class family members, like the women and the children, would either sit on stools or benches, or sometimes would eat standing up along the wall. And the tables, colonial tables, often were literally boards. They were boards on trestles, which could be set up for a meal and then taken down and leaned against the wall when you weren't using it. So the whole language of these chairs and boards has still carried through to the present day, where the chair of the board is the leader of a group. Having a seat at the table is an idiom for being able to take part in the discussion, to have a voice in the decisions. So if you had a seat at the table, it was really a step up from, eating your food standing up against the wall. Okay, from the Middle Ages through about the 19th century, if you had the wherewithal to host a formal dinner, it was served French style, which meant putting everything on the table at once. And the more of it, the better, and the better you looked. Jane Austen ate French style. So did George Washington. So did all those murderous players in Game of Thrones, if you've seen Game of Thrones. George Washington's Thursday dinners, while he was president, consisted of 3 courses each. Each course consisted of about 20 dishes, and everything went on the table at once. And depending upon where you sat at that table, if it was a good-sized table, you could end up, carving the swan or dishing out the soup. You certainly couldn't pass it around. You're at a table for 20. You want some of the duck liver that's way down there. This was really sort of an awkward form of eating, but it got fixed. This is Prince Kuryakin, and he supposedly introduced Russian-style dining to Europe and thence to America. So Russian-style dining was the idea that a meal was divided into multiple courses, individually served and cleared. Kuryakin was the Russian ambassador to France during the Napoleonic era, and he seems to have really cut a social swath. He was known as the Diamond Prince. He wore caftans. He wore diamond-trimmed slippers. He seemed to have been a great party guy, but possibly not much of a diplomat, since his post in Paris ended when Napoleon left to invade Moscow. So, something went wrong there. Anyway, his dinner style caught on. So by the 19th century, Victoria and Albert at Buckingham Palace were dining Russian style. So were the Astors and the Vanderbilts in New York. Downton Abbey, that was Russian style dining. In fact, Emily Post's etiquette book in 1922 says the only way to serve a dinner in New York City is Russian style, and if you don't have footmen, don't bother trying it. I have a copy of this book. I found the 1922 Emily Post at a library book sale years ago, and my family has been reading this ever since. It's hysterical. It tells you at what age your children should have their own calling cards, what color livery your footman should wear while the family is in mourning. You should have a silver service for 24 before you even think of getting out the gate as a young bride. It's a great book. You can sit there in your tiny little dining room and read it. Oh, cutlery. All right, in the heyday of Russian-style service, meals could consist of 12, 14 courses or more. And this led to an absolute explosion in silverware. Dozens of different spoons, knives, and forks for every conceivable kind of food. I have a list. Okay. For example, the Victorian dinner service had separate spoons for bouillon, cream, and aspic soups, separate spoons for tea and coffee, and for eggs. Egg spoons were traditionally made of mother of pearl because the yolk would stain silver. There were spoons for grapefruit, berries, marrow, melons. There were special forks for lobster, oysters, fruit, salad, strawberries, snails, sardines, and ice cream, to say nothing of this huge array of serving utensils, like cake breakers and cheese scoops and cracker spoons and butter picks, asparagus tongs. What do you suppose that thing is? Does anyone have one of these? That is a mango fork. I'm sure Emily Post would have told you that if you don't have a mango fork, there is no point in having company to dinner. This all got so out of hand that in 1925, Herbert Hoover, who was then Secretary of the Treasury, citing a national silver shortage, ordered the Bureau of Standards to limit the number of unique pieces of cutlery that you could have in a given flatware pattern. So no more than 55 different things. This is Richard III. Well, what's left of Richard. According to an anthropologist named Charles Brace, cutlery, and specifically the fork, changed our teeth. And it's kind of an interesting theory because usually nothing changes that fast evolutionarily. Spoons and knives are ancient, but forks are relatively recent. The best guess is that they were introduced to Europe, to Italy specifically, in the 12th century from the Middle East. They only made it to England in the 1600s. And nobody liked them much. Louis XIV discovered that his son's tutor was teaching them table manners and showing them how to use a fork, and he forbade the practice. No forks in my court. But the point with the teeth and the fork is the fork allowed people to eat smaller and smaller pieces, so eating became easier. In the Middle Ages, when you were eating basically with your hands and your knife, you'd stab a piece of something and then tear off hunks with your teeth. So you needed, a fairly good set of teeth. As you got smaller and smaller pieces and were forking it up, you didn't need to do this anymore. And there was a shift from edge to edge teeth. Try it. See how uncomfortable that feels? Edge to edge teeth to an overbite, which is what most of us have today. And it feels funny if you don't. In fact, they say that when the overbite came in, it actually changed the nature of language because there were certain consonants that you can't say very well, like this, like F's and V's. Friendly. They know that the wealthy who had forks developed the overbite first. But this would have been the development of a change in teeth over a period of about 300 years, which is, like a flash in the pan for evolution. But it looks like it might be true because Brace found that the Chinese developed the overbite about 900 years before the Europeans did. And that was about the same time that chopsticks began to be used as dinner tools rather than just for cooking. Oh, first course. Now we're into soup. There we have the first known written soup recipe. It's for lamb stew, if you can read cuneiform. This is at the Yale University's Babylonian collection. Dates to at least 1700 BCE. And it contains barley, onions, garlic, and apparently lamb. Now, soup is way, way older than that. In fact, they think soup probably preceded pottery because you can actually cook soup. I've never tried this. Can cook soup in a bark, even a paper container, because supposedly the liquid will keep it from catching on fire. I don't know. This doesn't seem right to me, but I read it. These Chinese pottery shards are the oldest known chunks of pottery. They're about 20,000 years old from China, and when found, they were surrounded by the remains of deer, birds, turtles, and shellfish. So the archaeological guess was that this is the survivor of possibly the world's first chowder fest. But there's no consensus on what's the best soup, though they do polls all the time. And the poll that is sponsored by Campbell's, which is a little self-serving, says that America's favorite soup is chicken noodle. Who's for chicken noodle? Nobody? Haha. Okay. In the 18th and 19th centuries, though, the absolute top of the soup list was turtle soup, which was made from the meat of green sea turtles, which are marine reptiles, they're gigantic. They have these shells that are as big as cartwheels or bigger. And of course, immediately turtle soup became a status symbol. In England, a turtle dinner was a synonym for an upscale civil dinner. In Charles Dickens' Hard Times, 1854, the epitome of social privilege was to dine on venison and turtle soup. In America, where we were all hooked on barbecue, turtle frolics displaced hog barbecues, and restaurants would serve vats of turtle soup that were made in the upturned shells of the turtles. And the seal up here on top with the turtle, with the flippers, is the symbol of the Hoboken Turtle Club, which was founded in 1796. Supposedly, it's America's oldest social club. And it boasted a complete roster of founding fathers. Washington, Jefferson, John Jay all belonged. Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton both belonged, possibly united in their devotion to turtle soup, which was routinely served with brandy and hard-boiled eggs. The Hoboken Turtle Club was really cagey about their turtle soup recipe. They claimed it contained walrus liver, which it did not. But at the height of the turtle craze, 15,000 live turtles a year were being picked up and shipped from the West Indies to the soup pots of England. And this practice soon drove the turtles to near extinction. And the solution to this was mock turtle soup, which is made with a calf's head. The general rule on turtle soup, even in recipe books of the time, was do not try this at home. You know, you yourself in your kitchen are really not capable of preparing a 600-pound turtle as a meal, so you should buy it from a nearby restaurant. In America, when the sea turtles became unavailable, here we have the terrapin. Americans turned to the much smaller terrapin. So we've basically wiped out green sea turtles. Now we're on the verge of wiping out terrapins with our passion for turtle soup. It turns out the terrapins were saved by prohibition because turtle soup isn't very good if it doesn't have sherry in it. And without sherry, nobody really wanted the turtle soup anymore. So one positive outcome of prohibition, the terrapins lived. Okay, we can't agree on the best soup, but historically the absolute worst soup came from Sparta in ancient Greece, and it was known as black broth. It was a staple of the Spartan military diet. Historians say it was a mix of boiled pig legs, blood, salt, and vinegar. And outsiders tasting this stuff said it was no wonder that the Spartans were always so ready to die. Okay, this is another candidate for most awful soup. This is a cake of portable soup. What you're looking at is a cake about yay big. It was also called veal glue. It's a dehydrated version of beef broth that came in, in the late 17th century. Basically, it was an early version of space food. And this piece is left over from Captain Cook's 1772 voyage to Australia, where he took along 1,000 pounds of portable soup. And according to his logbooks, sailors were flogged for refusing to eat it. There's an even worse story about Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark, when they set off for the Pacific Ocean, they didn't take much in the way of food. They were planning to hunt, trade, and forage along the way. So they took salt, they took spices, and they took 193 pounds of portable soup. Well, they seem to have first cracked it out in September 1805, And practically everybody that went with Lewis and Clark kept a diary or a journal of one kind or another. And this came from the journal of Patrick Gass, who was the expedition's carpenter. And according to Patrick, on this day, none of the hunters had found anything except a couple of pheasants, which, and barring a miracle, they couldn't possibly feed the 30 members of the expedition, plus a whole bunch of visiting Native Americans. So Captain Lewis decided to crack out the portable soup. So he handed out the portable soup, and it was so dreadful that the men decided instead to kill and roast one of the horses. So, portable soup. Appetizers, after the soup. So an appetizer is designed as a small, tempting dish intended to stimulate diners' appetites for the many, many, many courses that are about to follow. So there are any number of things that are served as appetizers, but high on the list historically were oysters. James Buchanan, America's only bachelor president, began his administration with an inaugural ball in March 1857. He had 6,000 guests, and he served them 400 gallons of oysters. That's 15 gallons of oysters apiece. People liked their oysters. And oysters aren't in everybody's cup of tea. If you look at polls of most hated foods, oysters often pop up along with things like tripe and Brussels sprouts and tofu, and if you're British, peanut butter. But historically, our ancestors adored oysters. And on coasts worldwide, there are oyster middens. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is a whaleback midden in Maine. It's on the Damariscotta River, and this is a pile of old oyster shells that's twice as long as the Titanic. It's 1,600 feet long, 1,000 feet wide. They think it's an accumulation of oyster feasts that took place between 200 BCE and 1000 CE. And New York City was once dotted with oyster shell middens. Pearl Street in New York was built on an oyster midden and paved with oyster shells. And what's interesting about these is that there's a stratigraphy to them. The lower you go in this huge pile of oyster shells, the bigger the shells get. And when you get down to the bottom of the heap, the oldest shells are gigantic. They're 10 inches across. They're the size of dinner plates, which is a difficult concept for most modern oyster eaters. I like oysters, but you know, the idea of the small, gulpable oyster is way different from an oyster the size of a Frisbee, you've got to admit. We don't know this. Huge oysters may be absolutely delicious, we just don't get them anymore. But even by the time the Dutch arrived in New York, the age of the huge oyster was gone due to overharvesting. They were still pretty hefty, though. William Makepeace Thackeray visited New York in 1852, had oysters, and compared it to swallowing a baby. So, you know, it was a sizable oyster. America at that time, when the European colonists arrived, was home to just a mind-boggling population of oysters. There were 350 square miles of oyster reefs around what is now New York City. They estimate that New York Harbor probably held half the world's oysters. And these oysters were fabulous. They could filter all the water of Long Island Sound in just a matter of days. So the water was always clear and lovely around New York. But by the 19th century, anything people like, it is not good to be a food that people like because you are doomed. By the 19th century, oysters were being eaten for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and paired with anything you could think of that you could possibly add an oyster to. Beefsteak, turkey, scrambled eggs, Virginia ham with oysters. In fact, Dolly Madison, famous in her day as First Lady, served oyster ice cream. Oh yeah, the walrus and the carpenter. At the height of this came to be called the oyster craze. In London, they were downing 700 million oysters a year. New Yorkers were eating 1 million oysters a day. So the result was inevitable. Like the walrus and the carpenter, eaten every one was pretty much what was happening worldwide. So this insatiable passion for oysters was wiping out the oyster beds, which meant that we were getting a lot more water pollution. And also these huge oyster beds had acted as breakwaters. So they were protecting coastal areas from hurricanes and general bad weather. So the loss of the oysters was environmentally a big deal. Let's see what we can eat next. Salad. When to serve the salad? Actually, should it be the third course? This has been a problem throughout history. The Romans were bothered by it. So green salad with oil and vinegar and a bit of salt has been on the human table since ancient times. And the Romans couldn't make up their mind about when it was best to eat it. Physicians said that the salad enhanced digestion, so eat it first. And gourmets, who said that the vinegar dressing made their wine taste funny, said it should be eaten last. And others argued that if you're going to eat salad at all, you should eat it just before you went to bed, because lettuce supposedly put you to sleep. Well, actually, I don't know how many stories to tell. Historically, lettuce has a reputation as an anti-aphrodisiac, which is unusual in the garden when practically every vegetable is said to be a turn-on. The ancient Greeks really worried that if you ate too much lettuce, it would cause impotence. Acetaria. John Evelyn, a famous diarist, wrote Acetaria, A Discourse of Salads, which is thought to be the first book in English solely devoted to raw vegetables in dressing. And he claimed, well, he might have gone right along with the anti-aphrodisiac. He claimed that salad greens had beneficial influences on morals, temperance, and chastity. So it's not hard to imagine that 17th century parents were probably shoving salad on their hormonal teenagers. He lists 73 different greens that could be put in green salad. And he wasn't about to add anything else to salad. Salads were for greens alone. And he spent many, many paragraphs discussing salad dressings. And there's a great story about salad dressing, which we just buy and don't worry about. But early on, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, it was believed that the best salad dressers came from France. And the gastronome, I can never pronounce his name, Jean Anthelme Ria Savarin, in The Physiology of Taste, tells this great rags to riches story about a young Frenchman who came to England, was sitting in a pub having dinner, and the young British men at the next table, realizing that he was French, asked him if he would come over and dress their salad for them. Well, he did it, and this was such a successful salad that he was subsequently invited to parties to dress salads. And he turned this into a profession. He became known as the fashionable salad dresser. He had a horse and carriage. He had a little fitted case that contained his oils and vinegars and herbs and spices. And he went from party to party dressing salads. And he was so successful that eventually he made his fortune, retired to France, bought a villa, and lived happily ever after. Salad, incidentally, was always an upper-class meal. The lower classes got pickles. This is Mrs. Lincoln, whom I had a terrible time finding a picture of. Her first name was Mary. You look up Mary Lincoln, and you want the cookbook Mary Lincoln, but you do not get the cookbook Mary Lincoln. You get Mary Todd Lincoln. Mrs. Lincoln's cookbook, which was published in 1884, has a horror story about how you are supposed to serve salad at your dinner table. You are supposed to arrange the leaves of the salad in the bowl from tiniest out to largest at the edges. So basically, it just looks like an exploded head of lettuce. But then the lady of the house is supposed to toss the salad at the table without disturbing the leaves. So you have to turn over each and every leaf so it maintains this same pattern in the salad bowl. You can imagine that people would have given anything to have had the fashionable salad dresser just take care of this problem for them. Course number 4. In the Middle Ages, if you were getting a fish, one of the prime picks was eels. Eel is not particularly popular on the modern American dinner table, even though supposedly eels are absolutely scrumptious and taste kind of like lobster. But most people think they're kind of creepy. The 11th century was probably peak consumption time for the freshwater eel. Eels made up what they think was 50% of the biomass in European rivers. Everybody who could get their hands on them, and most people did, ate them. In fact, medieval townships used to pay their rents, their taxes, in eels. According William the Conqueror's Doomsday Book, which came out in 1086, found that various landlords had had in-kind taxes paid in over 500,000 eels. And eels were so ubiquitous that there was actually a standard currency of eels. So a stick of eels was 25 eels, and a bind of eels was 10 sticks. And periodically people played with their eels. This is dreadful. The Venetians. In Venice, where eel is traditionally eaten on Christmas Eve, there was once a game called Eel in a Barrel. And the idea was that you put eels in a barrel, you darkened the water with something like cuttlefish ink so you couldn't see the eels, and then you bobbed for the eels, like bobbing for apples, and tried to grab the eel in your teeth. All right, on beyond eels. Now we've got herring. So fish eating in the Middle Ages owed its popularity in no small part to the Catholic Church, which demanded fasting on Fridays, on holy days, and the entire 40 days of Lent, which added up to about 150 meatless days a year, which upped the demand for fish. And the fish that most people got was salt herring. At the time, there were huge shoals of herring in the North and Baltic Seas. Reportedly, according to one reporter, who might have exaggerated a little, that boats had a hard time shoving their way through the herring. Scarborough Fair, remember Simon and Garfinkel's Scarborough Fair, which is such a lovely song? It was a herring fair. It was fish, which isn't quite as romantic. But salt herring was cheap. It kept for a long, long time. And so naturally, it was a prime edible for the Army, the Navy, orphanages, and the poor. And what people generally described it as was a flavorless fish jerky. And cooking it was a challenge. A popular solution was to load it up with mustard. And the other was to just wash the stuff down with a lot of alcohol. And there's a 15th century report by a Benedictine monk named Robert Ripton, who was really annoyed that in the time of Lent, when by law and custom of the church we're fasting, we're thinking about our sins, very few people abstain from excessive drinking. And when the drinkers were confronted, their response was, "Fish must swim." So by the 1500s, overfishing had pretty much collapsed the herring fisheries. And so we moved on to cod. That's the sacred cod. It hangs in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, where it has been for the last 200 years. And you can go see it today. It's wooden. Cod is a cold water fish. It's found from Norway to Iceland, Greenland, Newfoundland, and of course the coast of New England, where Cape Cod, which was first named the Shoal Hope, was rapidly changed to Cape Cod when we figured out how many cod there were in the water. And the trade of cod was so incredibly lucrative that a lot of early American colonists made their fortunes in fish. So in Massachusetts, the codfish aristocracy was the term for the nouveau riche who'd raked in on codfish. Well, centuries of cod fishing and overfishing, now the cod fisheries are down to what they think is like 1% of their former levels. So it's really not good to be a species that people like to eat. Okay, for the Victorian dinner, birds probably in the 19th century meant what your country mansion's shooting party had brought home from the field. Say pheasants, partridges, grouse, ducks, quail. Diners of the Middle Ages ate a far more eclectic selection of birds. They ate everything. Herons, peacocks, cranes, storks, and a lot of little songbirds, which they would capture by going out with nets and capturing thrushes and larks. All of this probably paved the way for American colonists being happy to eat the turkey, which you have to admit is an odd-looking bird. But on the upscale medieval dining table, swans, roasted and redressed in their feathers, were eaten popularly and just past their ugly duckling stage. These were young swans, just as they come into their white feathers. If you want one of these for your table, however, you shouldn't, because the swans were owned. There were swaneries, and the swans were marked, just like cattle are branded, with cut marks on their beaks that showed you who they belonged to. And here are some of the swanery marks that were registered. In fact, between 1450 and 1600, just around London, there were over 630 different swan marks that were registered. If you found an unmarked swan, you still couldn't grab it because by default, these swans belong to the crown. And they still do. So if you ever visit London, visit England, you see a swan sailing by on the Thames, hands off, they belong to King Charles. Pigeons. This is Martha, the world's last passenger pigeon who died in 1914 in the Cincinnati Zoo. And she was one of a phenomenal population of birds. They think when the Europeans first showed up in North America that passenger pigeons probably constituted 40% of the bird population of North America. They think there were up to 5 billion passenger pigeons at that time. Now all gone. The extinction of the passenger pigeon, they think, had two major causes. One was loss of habitat, roosting habitat. But the other was the commercial exploitation of pigeon meat because everyone loved pigeon pie. And there, dissected, is what a pigeon pie looked like. Well, if you weren't eating pigeons, chickens actually took a while. Chickens arrived in the Americas with the European settlers. There were chickens on the Mayflower. But archaeologists guess that the spread of chickens around the world really didn't have much to do with roast chicken or eggs. It had a lot to do with cockfighting. And that's because roosters are mean. Roosters don't like other roosters. Roosters come with snappy tempers and these bony leg spurs that they use to attack rival roosters, which is anybody who's moving in on their territory or their harem of hens. So roosters don't like other roosters. So in a cockfight, you chuck a pair of rival roosters into a ring called a cockpit and let them battle it out. And then you bet on who's going to win. It's probably the world's oldest spectator sport. The Greeks used to hold cockfights before going into battle just to get their soldiers in the right mood. In colonial America, it was the second most popular sport. The first was horse racing. And at least it was until 1774 when the Continental Congress banned it because they wanted the colonists to save their money. But cockfighting was legal in the United States well into the 20th century. I think it was only banned in Louisiana in the 1980s. Well, chickens. Chickens, unlike practically everything else that people were interested in eating, the passion for chickens actually led to more chickens. And this was because of Queen Victoria. In 1842, a guy named Edward Belcher came back from China and presented Queen Victoria with 7 chickens. And these were fabulous chickens. They were great big birds. They had green tail feathers. They lay mahogany-colored eggs. And the Queen was thrilled with them. There was a lot of joking about them. They were so big that they were compared to giraffes, which is why we have this cartoon. The guy who was responsible for this cartoon actually visited the chickens and said they attacked him and tried to eat his rubber boots. But the Queen had an aviary built for them at Windsor Castle near a tea pavilion where they could have tea and watch their chickens. And of course, once the Queen had exotic chickens, everybody wanted exotic chickens. So there was a rush on chickens and chicken breeding, which became called hen fever. And this crossed the Atlantic to America. We had it too. We were nuts about chickens. In 1849, there was a poultry show in Boston that pulled in 10,000 people who wanted to show off their chickens and possibly acquire more. So chickens, chicken breeding popular, but the chicken course was nothing compared to the beef course. The roast, from the time people could first nab one, has always been sort of the centerpiece, the big deal of dinner. So the Stone Age hunters roasted elk, deer, rhinoceros, wild horses, giant ground sloths. Though perhaps the most spectacular dinner dish in the Stone Age was woolly mammoth, a massive ancestor of the modern elephant. This is the Explorers Club in New York City, which brings us to what did roast mammoth taste like? Was it good? Well, in 1951, the Explorers Club claimed to have thrown a dinner at which mammoth was served. Now, this club dates back to 1904. It's had slews of famous members. Teddy Roosevelt was an Explorers Club member. So was Neil Armstrong. However, the club never ate woolly mammoth. A DNA analysis of the leftovers, and I don't know where they got the leftovers, I've been trying to find out, showed that what they actually ate was green sea turtle. However, there have been a number of studies done on what would a woolly mammoth have tasted like. Well, the closest modern descendant is the elephant. There are a lot of reasons not to eat an elephant, the most obvious being that the elephant is endangered. Less than 40,000 remaining. But from a culinary point of view, the most convincing argument comes from a guy named Rainer Gainen, who actually wrote an essay called What Does Elephant Taste Like? It was based on an amalgamation of historical descriptions from everybody he could find who ever ate some elephant and wrote about it. And his conclusion was that elephant tastes like Spam. Now this, if I had Wi-Fi, would be a roaring rendition of the song, The Roast Beef of Old England. Every country has a signature dish. You know, ours is probably hamburger. For Canada, it's poutine. And for the British, traditionally, it is roast beef. Queen Victoria ate roast beef at practically every meal. And this patriotic ballad, The Roast Beef of Old England, was practically a national anthem. It was sung by audiences in theaters before plays began. It was played in the mess when the officers of the Royal Navy sat down to eat. It's 7 verses long. And the point of it is that the British were made strong, bold, and intelligent by eating roast beef. And then we go into the second verse, which points out that the French, who danced and ate ragout, were wimpy and altogether inferior human beings. The French, who were annoyed, turned this around and started calling the British les roast beef, by which they meant uncouth bumpkins. So roast beef has had some political ups and downs. So we owe today's roast beef dinners to this truly scary animal. This is the aurochs, a pre-cow, which probably evolved in India between 1.5 and 2 million years ago. It then moved through Africa, Europe, Asia, seeking greener pastures. And the bulls on the walls of the 17,000-year-old Lascaux caves are aurochs. Julius Caesar talked about them. He saw them in Gaul while he was busy conquering Gaul. Described them as the size of an elephant and that they were killers of anything that got in their way, which made them very popular in the Roman arena, though God knows how they got them there. Nobody knows how this murderous aurochs eventually evolved into the cow. One guess is it's called the humongous pest theory. And it argues that when agriculture started, the grazing aurochs, who moved in immediately on these brand new lush-looking fields, annoyed farmers started corralling them in pens, and gradually the more rambunctious aurochs would have been slaughtered and eaten because you really don't want those around. But aurochs who were, a little calmer in temper would have been bred and eventually produced the cow. At least that's the best guess from science so far. So cows lead us into the next course, which is cheese. Cheese. Ordinarily served after the main entree and before dessert. And there's a lot to choose from because at best guess, there's something like 1,400 different cheeses worldwide. And all share the same historic root, which is we don't know where it came from. But basically, cheese was a solution to spoiling milk. The best guess about the origin of cheese is that somebody, somewhere, set out on a journey with a sack of milk in a sheep's stomach. And en route, the rennet in the stomach, which is the cocktail of enzymes that changes milk into cheese, and the jiggling of the journey churned this milk into curds and whey. Now, there's an absolutely identical story for the invention of butter, and the same for the invention of yogurt. So if you went out with milk in a stomach on horseback, you got something interesting. We do know that people were making cheese at least 7,000 years ago. And it's in the Odyssey when Odysseus and crew land on the island with the Cyclops. The Cyclops was a cheesemaker. His cave was full of all this cheese-making equipment, which he should have stuck to instead of trying to eat the Greeks, which was a problem. Oh, this is an old cheese press. The secret to cheese is pressing. The more moisture you squeeze out of the curds, the longer lasting the cheese. So soft, fresh cheese, think chèvre and mozzarella, don't have anywhere near the staying power of harder, drier cheeses. And historically, the most famous example of hard cheese was called Suffolk cheese. And this stuff was nicknamed Suffolk Bang, presumably from the noise it made when you dropped it on a table. It was hard as a rock, and it was the favored pick of the 18th century British Navy. It survived forever at sea, which seems to have been its sole selling point. And there's a going joke of the day that said that there was a batch of Suffolk cheese that was being shipped out in an iron chest on its way to the East Indies. A rat managed to chew its way through the iron chest, but made no headway at all trying to chew the cheese. So eventually there were so many complaints that the Navy moved on to more chewable cheeses. If you wanted to give a present to famous people of any kind, a big cheese seems to have been the way to go at a certain period of time. In 1840, the cheesemakers of Cheddar in England absolutely outdid themselves for Queen Victoria's wedding, which was a phenomenal affair at which the Queen wore a white dress and started a fad for white wedding dresses that has gone on forever. But the cheesemakers gave her a 1,250-pound cheddar cheese. She doesn't seem to have been thrilled with it, and when the cheesemakers said could they borrow it back to show it off at a fair, she said fine. And then when they wanted to give it back to her, she wouldn't take it. But this is just one of many giant cheeses that was given to people. In 1802, Thomas Jefferson got a giant cheese. He got it from the citizens of Cheshire, Massachusetts, who pointed out kind of snarkily that it was made solely from the milk of free cows by free people. Take that, Jefferson. And it was, interestingly, this was the first object to which the word mammoth was applied, meaning great big. And this was because the first mammoth skeleton had just been dug up and put together by Charles Wilson Peale, and he was showing it off in what really became the first American Science Museum. So there was sort of a mammoth fever. Everybody was interested in mammoths. So there was a lot of boasting about mammoth things of various kinds, mammoth loaves of bread and mammoth radishes and mammoth cheeses. He put this in the East Room of the White House, which immediately became known as the Mammoth Room. And they still apparently were eating this thing a year later. Nobody knows what finally became of the remains, but they think they threw it in the Potomac River. Dessert. Well, nobody can agree about the desirability of oysters, eels, Brussels sprouts, even cheese. But practically everybody likes dessert. until cane sugar and sugar-making techniques finally reached the Middle East from Asia in the 9th century. The best sweetener going was probably honey. There were a few other things like syrup of figs. In North America, of course, the Native Americans had maple syrup, but there wasn't really much good sweeteners around. This little bit of chemistry, this is lead diacetate. As sweeteners go, this is probably your worst possible pick. The Romans made this. It's a sweetener that they made from concentrated grape juice that was made even sweeter if you concentrated it in a lead-lined kettle. During prolonged boiling, lead leached into the syrup, reacting with acetate ions in the grape juice, and you got this compound, lead diacetate. And the Romans fooled around with this and found that you could skip the whole grape juice boiling thing, and you could just make lead diacetate without bothering with the grape juice by mixing lead oxide with vinegar, and it made a kind of powdery substance that could be spooned into things like sugar. And they used to load their wine up with this stuff. Well, this is bad news. Lead is not good for us. And there are a lot of factors that have been proposed as leading to the fall of Rome, like invading barbarians, difficult Christians, decadent emperors, a really wobbly economy. But lead poisoning was said to play a part, and the passion for wine sweetened with lead diacetate probably did them no good at all. In the Middle Ages, the favorite honey sweet was gingerbread, which was a mix of flour, honey, and spice. You baked it in a cookie mold. Sometimes you trimmed it with gold leaf if you wanted to be really upscale. It's mentioned in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. People-shaped gingerbread is sometimes attributed to Queen Elizabeth I, who supposedly, at a diplomatic banquet, ordered gingerbread in the forms of all the guests. It's not clear how the visiting dignitaries responded to having, a dessert where you had to bite off your own head, which can be a problem with gingerbread men even today. But supposedly that's the root of gingerbread men. Gingerbread was really popular at medieval fairs, which were called sometimes gingerbread fairs. And sweethearts used to trade gingerbread cookies, and unattached girls would eat what they called gingerbread husbands, because the story went that this would help you find a real one. This is the real money sweetener, though. This is sugar cane, the stuff that fills our sugar bowls today. It probably originated in New Guinea. They think it was domesticated about 8,000 years ago, probably as food for pigs. And it spread to Southeast Asia, China, India, where Alexander the Great noticed it, but didn't think that much of it in the 4th century BCE. By the time it reached Europe, it cost an arm and a leg, because only the very rich could afford it after it had passed through all these middlemen on the way from Asia to Europe. But they loved it. So by the 16th century, following the discovery of Americas, the first thing that people realized was that this was a great climate for growing sugarcane. Columbus had already planted sugarcane on his second voyage to the New World. By 1516, the Portuguese were growing sugarcane in their brand new colony of Brazil. So you were saving a lot of money if you could grow your own sugarcane. Sugar prices dropped astronomically in Europe, so everybody could have sugar. But this was a horrible situation. According to one estimate, 12 million Americans were transported to work in the sugar plantations. And did I say Americans? I'm sorry, 12 million Africans. And these people, once they arrived, had a maximum life expectancy of 7 years. The sugar plantations were absolutely brutal. And the end result of all this misery was cheap sugar. This picture is of what are called sugar subtleties. And once you got your paws on sugar, in the 15th and 16th century, impressive dinners featured these sugar spectaculars, these enormous sculptures of sugar. Talented chefs could make absolutely anything out of sugar. You know, full-blown sailing ships with sails, models of castles and cathedrals. In 1600, when Marie de Medici married Henry IV of France, Henry didn't show up. He stayed home. But there was a life-size sugar image of him on horseback, which hopefully comforted the bride for not having a groom at the altar. If you really wanted a sensation, though, for a 17th century dessert, you offered the guests a pineapple. That fruit would remain on the top of the dessert heap for the next 300 years. Columbus first came upon pineapples on his second voyage, 1493, and he described them as looking like big green pine cones. And he wasn't too excited about them because he was really hoping for gold. But once people got a taste of these things, they were thrilled. And soon the pineapple was acknowledged as the rarest, yummiest, best thing you could possibly have in fruit. And it was really expensive. Only the very rich could afford them. If you had a pineapple on top of the fruit on your dessert table, it was the ultimate in status. Today, it's yachts and gold bathroom fixtures. In the 17th century, pineapples. This is fake news. This is a picture of King Charles II and a pineapple being offered to him by the royal gardener. Well, pineapples were hard to get. They didn't transport long distance very well. In the 3 months it often took to get across the Atlantic to deliver a pineapple from the Caribbean to England, pineapples would rot. And you couldn't grow them in Europe because the climate certainly wasn't warm enough or humid enough to make pineapples happy. So people were struggling to come up with a greenhouse, some way of growing these pineapples. Charles I, who loved pineapples, famously had his portrait painted with them in the 1670s, at which point he could not possibly have had a homegrown pineapple. Homegrown pineapples didn't show up in England for another 40 years. This is a lie. Though you can see him there with a King Charles Spaniel, which was sort of cute. The earliest reputable report of pineapples showing up in Europe were in the Netherlands, where they were really advanced in the way of building greenhouses. And once this got around, how to build a greenhouse, everybody wanted a greenhouse. So everybody who could leaped on the pineapple bandwagon. I love this thing. So there were pineapples that were carved on gate posts, sculpted over doorways. They were on weather vanes. They were woven into carpets and tablecloths. They were painted on chairs. Men carried pineapple-shaped snuff boxes. Wedgwood produced a line of pineapple-shaped teapots. And this is the summer house belonging to John Murray, the 4th Earl of Dunmore, who was a pineapple fan, and he put a gigantic pineapple on the roof of his summer house. Now, raising a pineapple was really expensive. It could take 2 years or more for these things to ripen, and you needed a lot of coal to heat your pineapple encasing greenhouse. So each pineapple, by the time it was ready to pick, probably cost $8,000, is the guess, in today's money. So if you got a pineapple, you didn't really want to eat it right away. You wanted to show it off. So people would keep these as long as they possibly could. They would loan them to their friends and neighbors so that they could show off the pineapple too. And if you really, really could not afford a pineapple, you could rent a pineapple for your dinner party for a much reduced fee, provided you returned it in the morning. But then you were really at risk of professional pineapple thieves. Though if you were caught pinching a pineapple, you got transported to Australia, so you had to be good at it. It could be difficult. Okay, we're at the end. I'm sorry, I always run over. Coffee and tea, port and nuts. So this is the last hurrah of a formal dinner. Usually it ended with an after-dinner drink taken as a digestif to help your tummy, accompanied by finger nibbles, usually dishes of walnuts. And supposedly, this would all aid in digestion. You've just had a multi-course meal, and was really the only thing you could do other than loosening your cummerbund or cursing your corset in that day and age. And often this was accompanied by a comforting glass of port. Port is a fortified wine. It's like sherry or George Washington's favorite Madeira. So it was a wine to which distilled alcohol, like brandy, was added to boost the wine's alcohol content. And port came from Portugal. And in the early 18th century, it came from an area called the Douro Valley, which was basically the Wild West. It was all bandits. You couldn't get to it. There were no roads easily leading into it. The rivers were a mass of whirlpools and rapids. And once you got there, it wasn't great. There was an account by one guy, Thomas Woodmass, who went there in 1703 because he was going to make his fortune in port. He was captured by bandits, tied to a tree. They stole all his clothes. And apparently he thought the wine was worth it. And the point of it in Britain was that you got it from Portugal, and you could avoid importing your wine from the hated French, with which there was a very on-off relationship. I can stop there. You've all had enough, haven't you? Yeah, it's gone on. The age of port. Samuel Johnson said he could drink 3 bottles of port in an evening without being the worse for it. And William Pitt, the younger, who was a prime minister under George III, said every time he had to speak in Parliament, he would drink a bottle of port before he went to the floor. So port was great stuff, and we should all end our meals with it. I am done. This is the scullery maids. This is where we end up doing the dishes. For the average Victorian meal, you could end up with a total of 1,000 dishes to be washed. And this isn't counting things like the pots and pans and mixing bowls and serving dishes and gravy boats. And this was often done by kids. Scullery maids used to start out at the age of like 9 or 10. So, thank God for the dishwasher. Guys, thank you for being so very patient.